In July of 2020, the Walt Disney World Resort reopened after a roughly 4-month hiatus due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the longest that Disney theme parks has been closed, ever. And it wasn't just the Florida parks. Every single Disney park across the globe was shut down for some length of time caused by these health concerns.
In a statement, Disney's saying, "In an abundance of caution and in the best interest of our guests and employees, we are proceeding with the closure of our theme parks. Hotels will remain open until further notice. Disney Cruise Lines will suspend all new departures beginning Saturday through the end of the month."
As the resorts begin to open back up, it looks drastically different with mask mandates, temperature screening, social distancing, and smaller crowds made up primarily of pass holders and local residents. While this is an entirely new territory for the theme park industry, this is not our nation's first time combating a pandemic. In this video, we'll be traveling back to 1918 to try to understand the Spanish flu and how it almost claimed the life of a young Walt Disney. Hi everyone, I'm Brandon Specht, and this is your disclaimer. I've recently gone down a rabbit hole of information on the 1918 influenza pandemic, but I'm not a doctor. That doesn't make me an expert by any means. So if I miss any information, or if anything I cover is kind of confusing, go ahead and shoot me a comment below and we'll discuss it a little bit further. We'll discuss it with charm and civility. Also, stick around because I sing at the end of this video. Okay, so let's jump back to December 5th, 1901. That's when Walt Disney was born in Chicago, Illinois. Now, most of those hardcore Disney fans will be quick to tell you that he spent most of his childhood in Marceline, Missouri. In fact, his family would spend about a decade in Missouri before moving back to Chicago. He didn't have it easy by any means. His dad was super strict, and Walt definitely learned the value of hard work. Drawing and art became his favorite means of escape. During World War I, Walt began drawing little patriotic cartoons for the McKinley High School newspaper. They usually promoted a simple message like support your troops or ration certain foods, etc. But for Walt, it wasn't quite enough. Walt began to wonder if he couldn't do more to support his country during the war. It turns out young Walt was really concerned with being called a slacker, so I have to assume that at that point in time, the term slacker was considered pretty slanderous, pretty derogatory. So I thought it might help us out if I went through and grabbed the definition for what it means to be a slacker. First, a slacker is a person who evades his or her duty.
It's not that kind of duty.
It can also be an educated person who is purposeless, apathetic, and, this one's interesting to me, anti-materialistic.
How great is this? Now we're both living on Easy Street.
And finally, this one makes a lot of sense. A slacker can also be a person who avoids military service. There it is. So Walt, it would seem, was anxious to avoid one or more of those things. He often expressed a great deal of shame for being stuck at home while American soldiers were fighting overseas. Unfortunately for him, there really wasn't much he could provide in terms of military service. At the time, he would have been around 15, 16 years old, which was way too young to join the U.S. military. In June of 1917, Walt's older brother Roy joined the Navy. Walt, anxious to do his part, discovered that the American Ambulance Corps accepted volunteers as young as 17 years old. They weren't picky either because most of the healthy men had already gone off to join the military. Walt, who currently was 16 years old, decided to put those artistic abilities to the test. He changed the date of birth on his birth certificate so it would appear he was 1 year older. After enlisting into the American Ambulance Corps, his next challenge would be explaining the situation to his parents, who, by the way, weren't too happy when they found out. Walt made a pretty good case, though. He told his parents that someday when he had children, he didn't want them asking, "Why weren't you in the war?" or "Were you a slacker?" I told you I'd bring that word back, but we're not done yet. So for now, let's head over to an Army training facility in the great state of Kansas. We'll see Walt again in just a few minutes. An Army cook at the base started to develop some pretty standard symptoms of an illness. Initially, he experienced a sore throat, fever, and headache. But later that day, more than 100 fellow soldiers started reporting similar symptoms. Keep in mind, troops often live in close quarters to one another, so it's the perfect breeding ground for an infection like this. Within a few days, more than 500 men at the facility had taken ill. After a few weeks, the number would be well over 1,000. After little more than a month, 46 men had died at the facility. As you might imagine, people in the military, they travel a lot. And this particular virus was extremely contagious. So similar outbreaks started appearing in military facilities across the country and even in parts of the world outside of America. In March of 1918, 84,000 American troops headed to Europe. In April, another 118,000 followed. By June, 31,000 cases of H1N1 influenza A virus were reported in Great Britain. It wouldn't be long before German forces would see the effects of the epidemic as well. This was crazy fast. Cases even started to appear outside of Europe. It became a full-on pandemic in a matter of months, well, more like weeks. So that term, pandemic, it's a word that has been a bit controversial, at least at the beginning of the 2020 health crisis. Some people were very quick to tell you that the coronavirus was a pandemic, but others denied it or even put the term in quotation marks. So now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, a pandemic is defined as a disease or illness that is prevalent throughout an entire country, continent, or across the entire globe. In other words, an epidemic over a large area. So just as a matter of fact, the coronavirus outbreak is definitively a pandemic. Back in March of 2020, the World Health Organization made that declaration as soon as it met the criteria.
Describing the situation as a pandemic does not change WHO's assessment of the threat posed by the virus. It doesn't change what WHO is doing, and it doesn't change what countries should do.
So if I had to guess why people, politicians, and governments are so uneasy with the term pandemic, it's because it tends to do things like abrupt the economy and impact the day-to-day of how society is run. I mean, can we all agree on that? Can anyone else remember a time when toilet paper was in such high demand? Because the 1918 pandemic happened at the same time that the United States was involved in World War I, our nation's leaders became increasingly more concerned on how the virus might have an impact on things like military enlistment. That's where the Sedition Act of 1918 comes in. The Sedition Act! This was created by the federal government. Under this act, it became a crime for any American to interfere with the nation's war effort. The wartime law even prevented the press from reporting significant information on the 1918 outbreak spreading throughout our country. President Woodrow Wilson was responsible for the Sedition Act and appointed what he called the Committee for Public Information. The architect of that committee had this to say about their purpose.
Truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. The force of an idea lies in its inspirational value. It matters little if it's true or false.
So this was basically an outline for the government to decide what was true or false concerning the 1918 influenza pandemic. The government's influence was so strong that media outlets began comparing the H1N1 influenza A virus to just a simple seasonal flu in order to keep the public calm about a growing epidemic that was spreading throughout our country. The lack of preventative precautions left our nation, and in truth, the entire world, unprepared to handle this outbreak. Symptoms would be misdiagnosed due to the lack of information. This would wind up being one of the major reasons that so many people lost their lives to the Spanish flu. So let's be perfectly transparent here. America was not the only country withholding information from its citizens. Many of the European nations, specifically those involved in the war, did exactly the same thing. Now, if you remember, Spain would remain neutral throughout World War I. That is likely the biggest reason why their press outlets could freely report on the pandemic. News of the sickness first made headlines in Madrid in May 1918, so roughly 2 months after America's first case. 2 months. It got even more attention after the Spanish King Alfonso XIII took ill. Since other nations hadn't been reporting on the epidemic, people just kind of started to believe that Spain was ground zero. So much of the world started to adopt the name Spanish flu in referencing this virus. And in parts of America and England, some people even use the slang term Spanish lady. For reasons I can't quite understand, we still see similar practices in 2020. I'm assuming you've all heard of terms like the Chinese virus or perhaps Kung flu when referencing the coronavirus. The practice serves little purpose outside of establishing a point of origin, which we've already seen in the case of the Spanish flu isn't even that reliable. All right, before you feel too bad for the Spanish in this case, I do want to make a quick point, okay? Over in Spain, they would refer to this, the 1918 influenza pandemic, this particular pandemic, they would refer to it as, you ready? The French flu. Because, obviously, they assumed they got it from France. Are you understanding how ridiculous this practice is, how insane this practice is, and how it really serves absolutely no purpose? The first wave of the Spanish flu would seem mild compared to what was to come. In the fall of 1918, America was beginning its deadly second wave. On September 28th, in Philadelphia, there was a special event held to promote the sale of war bonds. The Philadelphia Liberty Loan Parade saw something like 200,000 people attend. It also led to the United States' largest outbreak. It's estimated that this one event led to 12,000 deaths, which is absolutely insane. Okay, so around that time, Walt Disney reported to Camp Scott in Chicago. Unfortunately, the second wave of influenza arrived around the same time, so it wouldn't be long before Walt would become sick and was sent home, which in this case, that was the ideal option since people in hospitals were considered much worse off. He was carried to his parents' door in a stretcher. While taking care of him, both Walt's mother and his sister Ruth became ill as well. Given time, however, all three Disneys would recover. They were lucky. It's been estimated that more than 25 million Americans experienced the Spanish flu firsthand. The virus would take something like 668,000 lives in just the United States. Since there was no vaccine, the only way to deal with the virus was through quarantine, hygiene, facial masks, and by limiting public gatherings, or as we call it today, social distancing. Many churches, schools, and storefronts were closed down. In some cities, everyone was required to wear face masks. In fact, in San Francisco, you'd be fined $5 if you weren't wearing a mask. My understanding is that back then, $5 was quite a lot. It was okay though, it wasn't a problem because back then, Americans were proud to support safety measures, including facial coverings. Although I'm told that masks back then, they were horrible. They were extremely uncomfortable. They were made of material like gauze. But our nation was at war. These health practices were viewed as patriotic. The Red Cross even put out a PSA that reminded people that the man or woman or child who will not wear a mask is now a, and you ready for this? Dangerous slacker. During World War I, we saw more soldiers die from the Spanish flu than those were killed in battle. When the war ended on November 11th, 1918, people took to the streets in celebration, which was totally understandable, but you have to remember, this was at the height of the pandemic. As soldiers began to return home, the pandemic continued to surge, and as patriotism began to wane, these anti-mask leagues began to pop up. Somewhere around 300,000 Americans died during the second wave of the Spanish flu. By the time young Walt Disney recovered from the Spanish flu, the war was essentially over, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't still work that needed to be done. So, about a week after Armistice Day, young Walt Disney picked up and traveled over to France to help out with the evacuation of US troops. He'd spend roughly a year there. The crazy part of this story, at least for me, is considering what could have happened if Walt Disney had not survived the Spanish flu. There'd be no Mickey Mouse, no Snow White, no Disneyland. I think it's fair to say that the 20th century might have looked a lot different. So as we continue to adjust to the 2020 pandemic, I'd like to encourage all of our viewers to do their part. Don't be a slacker. Help America flatten the curve. You'll be saving lives and making it a heck of a lot easier to plan your next trip to Walt Disney World. But hey, that's just my 2 cents. What do you all think? Was there anything that I forgot to say about the 1918 pandemic? And how's your life changed in response to the 2020 pandemic? Let's chat about it in the comments section below. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Details. Don't forget to click the like button. It really helps us out. And if you're feeling especially generous, why not click subscribe to Retrospectrum? It's a great way to show your appreciation. Now, if you've stuck around for this long, I have to assume you want to hear me sing. Please don't expect very much. I'm so sorry, Mel Brooks. It's the Sedition. What an act. By Woodrow Wilson. No more facts. He's on a mission to distort the news. No epidemic. You'll go to jail. Don't say pandemic. No chance of bail. We'll just convince them it's just an average flu.